I never thought a single sentence could break you. He said it loud in class so every kid could hear. If your daughter's that weak, why bring her here? I heard it over the phone while I was between jobs and home. She was calling, crying, and the teacher kept teaching like nothing had happened. My first reaction was dumb and instinctive. I wanted to run into the school and punch him. Then I realized the world doesn't work like the movies. A bloody fist would only give others a reason to say I was too emotional. I didn't want my truth discredited by my own anger. So I did something else. I started counting. Dates, times, words. I recorded her crying, saved screenshots of the disciplinary notes, printed every message from the school. I went to the doctor and got a note documenting my daughter's emotional distress. When I put it all together, my outrage turned into a cold instrument. They thought it would blow over. The teacher as the tough educator, the school defending its staff, parents shrugging it off. I decided to do it differently. I wasn't seeking revenge in a dark alley. I wanted revenge the law would recognize, a way to restore my daughter's dignity, public exposure, formal complaints, and a sum that would hit the man who believed he could humiliate people without consequence. The first week was slow and bureaucratic. I filed a formal complaint with the principal. The email got that corporate speak reply. Thank you for bringing this to our attention. We will investigate. That phrase, we will investigate, is the world's slowest knife. The school asked for a statement. I wrote 3 pages, clear and calm with timestamps and quotes. I attached the doctor's note, the screenshots, and the voicemail where my daughter was still sobbing. I also went to the district office. The woman behind the counter listened and then leaned forward. You did the right thing documenting everything, she said. We can open a disciplinary file, but you need witnesses, patterns. One incident is harder to move on than a pattern. That word, pattern, was the spark I needed. So I started looking. I texted other parents from the class list, the ones I'd always waved to at pickup. Hey, I wrote, did your kid ever mention Mr. H? The replies came slowly. One mother said her son had been called weak too last fall. Another parent forwarded a screenshot of a passive-aggressive email from the same teacher to a worried parent. A former student messaged me late at night. He said Mr. H had a temper and that he'd once sworn at a child in front of the class. Piece by piece, a picture formed that wasn't about a single bad day but about conduct. People were embarrassed or afraid of being labeled troublemakers, or convinced nothing would happen. My job, suddenly, was to make it unsafe for them to be silent. I hired a lawyer. That felt dramatic, like stepping into a world of suits and briefcases that didn't belong to me, but I needed someone who understood how to push the gears of the system. He was a quiet man named Patel, mid-40s, who smelled faintly of coffee in old courtrooms. He read my materials and nodded. You've done what most people never do, he said. You kept receipts. We can build a civil case for emotional distress. And we will file a formal complaint with the State Board of Education. That second piece, the professional discipline, is what hurts a teacher, not just a lawsuit. He explained how it would work without jargon. Evidence to show pattern, affidavits from witnesses, medical documentation for my daughter, and an expert statement about the psychological impact. The courtroom wasn't my goal, the courtroom was a tool. Publicity was another. If the complaint sat quietly in a file drawer, it wouldn't change anything. If it echoed beyond the district office, if it reached a reporter, a PTA meeting, a school board agenda, pressure would follow. So we did 2 things at once, legal and local. Patel drafted affidavits. I went back through messages and emails and dug out every small thing that pointed to a pattern. I asked parents to sign sworn statements. Some hesitated and then agreed. Some refused. That's how it always is. Courage is messy and costly. Those who joined me did so because they felt they owed their kids a place where teachers teach, not humiliate. On the local side, I started talking to people out loud. In line at the grocery store, in the school parking lot, at the coffee shop, I told a short version of the story without screaming. The words felt different when I said them in a room with other adults. People nodded. A few offered names of other parents who had private misgivings. One mother handed me a voicemail she'd kept from her son, a trembling voice recounting a humiliating incident. It was small and awful and perfect for what we needed. The school fought the steady escalation exactly how I expected. Bland reassurances, a promise of training, sensitivity workshops, temporary schedule changes. But when Patel wrote to the superintendent and attached the signed affidavits, things shifted. It became a problem that couldn't be mopped with a memo. Then I did the part that made people uncomfortable. I went to the press. Not big national outlets, local newspapers and a community radio station that still mattered here. I picked a reporter who'd done a consumer column exposing landlord scams and told her the story. I handed her the file. She read the affidavits, the doctor's note, listened to the voicemail. She asked the questions reporters always ask: who, when, how, and filed a short piece that ran the next week. Parent accuses local teacher of humiliating students. District opens formal inquiry. It wasn't dramatic, but it put the incident into the public record. Public record matters. The next PTA meeting was full. People who'd once shrugged now stood up, speaking in ways they hadn't dared before. The school placed the teacher on paid administrative leave pending investigation. For parents, paid leave is not justice, it's a necessary pause. For a teacher's career, it's a red flag. For the local news, it was enough to keep following. That's when the first call came from the school lawyer, a thinly veiled attempt to intimidate. "We encourage you to consider mediation," he said. "No one wants this in the press." Translation: pay to make it go away. I answered calmly. "I'm not here for money from the school," I said. "I want safety, accountability, and a correction." He paused, then repeated the line about mediation. But I had learned a long time in life. People who offer mediation often want a quiet fix. Quiet fixes preserve reputations. They also allow repeat offenses. I told Patel I wasn't interested in a private settlement with the school. I wanted real consequences. The pressure mounted. The district accelerated its inquiry, the local union sent someone to observe, and parents kept turning up with more stories. The board scheduled an emergency hearing. For me, every new signature and voice felt like a small stitch in a larger repair. What I hadn't expected was the personal cost. Friends who were teachers advised caution, worried that I'd become that dad. Other parents whispered that causing trouble was risky. I started getting cold calls late at night, anonymous numbers, heavy breathing, a single click of silence before the line went dead. The kind of intimidation that sounds small but is designed to erode you overnight. I kept going. For my daughter. For the other kids. For the principle that a classroom should be a place of learning, not a stage for cruelty. The district hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning, 9 a.m. The auditorium filled with folding chairs and crisp coffee cups. I wore a suit I haven't had to buy in years. It felt like armor. The teacher's supporters were there too, a few parents who swore he was tough but fair, and a man I recognized from the school board shaking his head. When the superintendent read the complaint aloud, the room grew smaller. I read my daughter's voicemail into the record. I felt the words scrape my throat. The teacher's lawyer argued tone and context. Then, slowly, the board voted to recommend a civil action for damages and to forward the file to the State Board of Education for possible professional discipline. The recommendation included a demand for restitution, $20,000 for emotional harm and lost peace. That sum, $20,000, felt both abstract and very personal. It was not a number plucked from the air. It was the product of hospital billing projections, counseling estimates, and a civil attorney's calculation of how to make the penalty real. It was a price designed to matter to a man who'd believed words were weightless. As I walked out of the auditorium, a journalist caught me by the elbow and asked how I felt. I told her, simply, that justice isn't vengeance. It's making sure the same mistake isn't repeated. She nodded, wrote it down, and darted back to her notebook. But the fight wasn't over. Civil recommendations must be enforced and the state board must act. There would be hearings, counsels, and appeals. The teacher could fight, lawyer up, and paint himself as a victim of an overeager parent. That's the theater I was entering. Slow, messy, legal. It was nothing like the raw instant of anger I had felt in my car the day my daughter called crying. It was better. I had made the choice, not to swing my fist, but to use the law and the court of public opinion. I had taken the small, everyday things, screenshots, voicemails, doctor's notes, and turned them into leverage. I had turned shame into evidence. 2 weeks later, I got a voicemail from the teacher's attorney. They wanted to discuss settlement before the hearing. The voice was oily and careful. They offered an apology, a smaller sum, and conditions. No press, no board action, a private write-up in the personnel file. It read like the same old offer I'd refused earlier. I listened. Then I looked at the last item in my folder, a printout of my daughter's handwriting from the week before, a picture she'd drawn of our family in which she'd written, "Daddy keeps me safe." I thought of the look on her face when she hung up, the night her teacher had spoken louder than he should have. I left the phone on the table and walked out onto the porch. The neighborhood was quiet. Somewhere, a lawn sprinkler hissed. I felt the slow, steady calm of someone who had decided on a course of action and refused to be diverted. I called Patel and said, "No deal. We go to hearing." He didn't sound surprised. Good, he said. We win in evidence or we win in court. Either way, this ends different than it began. I slotted the phone back into the folder and closed it. Outside, the day went about its business. Kids on bikes, a dog barking. Inside, a small, carefully built storm was about to land on someone who'd made his life a platform for humiliation. After I said, "No deal," the whole thing started to move faster, like someone had pressed a button I didn't know existed. The school tried one last time to calm me down, offering restorative meetings and confidential resolution. But I wasn't interested in sitting in a room pretending to forgive someone who still believed he'd done nothing wrong. I wanted a record, something that would stay in his file long after he forgot my daughter's name. The civil hearing date was set for March 18th. I marked it on the calendar in red. For weeks, I woke up early and read every email, every message from my lawyer like they were morning prayers. Patel told me we had enough. 5 witness statements, the doctor's evaluation, 2 voicemails, and 1 article that wouldn't stop circulating online. But the teacher, Mr. H, wasn't staying quiet either. His lawyer filed a response claiming parental harassment, saying I'd created a coordinated smear campaign. They even mentioned my posts in a local Facebook group, twisting my words into something almost criminal. That's when I realized, revenge isn't a straight line. It's a spiral. The moment you think you're in control, it curves back toward you. Still, I wasn't backing down. The week before the hearing, Patel called me into his office. He was calm as always, but I could see he'd been reading something important. He slid a paper across the desk, a letter from the teacher's insurance company. They're offering full payment, he said. I frowned. Full payment? You mean the $20,000? Yes. But with conditions. You sign a non-disclosure agreement. You can't talk about it publicly, you can't share documents, you basically pretend it never happened. I stared at the paper. The number was right there. 20,000. The exact figure the board had recommended. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like silence. Why now? I asked. Patel shrugged. Because the article did damage. They're protecting reputation, not conscience. He told me the smart move was to take the deal. He said it quietly, kindly, like someone telling you to rest after a long fight. You've already won, he said. Your daughter's safe. He suspended. Take the money, sign it, move on? But something in me refused. Maybe pride. Maybe principle. Or maybe I'd already gone too far to stop halfway. I don't want the money, I said. I want the verdict. He sighed. Then you'll get it. But be ready, they'll come hard now. Character attacks, maybe even fake reports. I nodded. Let them. The night before the hearing, my daughter fell asleep beside me on the couch. She was clutching her favorite book, the one she used to hate reading because he'd mocked her pronunciation once. Now she read it out loud just to prove she could. I listened to her small, even breaths and promised myself, no matter how this ended, she'd never feel powerless again. That promise became my fuel. The hearing room was smaller than I imagined. No judge's bench, just a table, microphones, and faces that looked tired before it even began. The teacher sat across from me pretending to look calm. But I saw the tremor in his hand when he reached for his coffee. His lawyer started first, long speech about misunderstandings, strict teaching methods, and parental overreaction. Then it was my turn. I didn't read from paper. I spoke from memory, about the day my daughter came home crying, about how she'd stopped talking at dinner for a week, about the doctor's note that said, acute stress reaction. When I finished, the room was silent. Even the teacher looked away. Patel stood and added the evidence. Screenshots, witness statements, and the district report confirming similar complaints from past years. The teacher's lawyer objected to half of it, but the board allowed most of it in. It took 2 hours, but when it was done, the conclusion felt clear. The board recommended full damages and professional discipline. That meant he'd pay the $20,000 and lose his teaching license for at least 3 years. I didn't cheer. I didn't even smile. I just exhaled, slow and long, like I'd been holding my breath for months. But that wasn't the end. The teacher appealed. He filed a defamation suit against me personally, claiming I'd ruined his reputation and career prospects. It was ridiculous, a desperate swing, but it still meant months more of letters, filings, and waiting. At first I panicked. I didn't have the money to fight a long civil suit. But Patel just smiled. Let him. The best way to destroy a liar is to let him keep talking. He was right. The appeal collapsed in less than 6 weeks. The judge dismissed it after reviewing the evidence. When the final letter came, case dismissed, I sat at the kitchen table with a coffee and stared at it for a long time. I thought I'd feel joy. I didn't. I just felt done. The revenge wasn't sweet. It was cold, quiet, heavy. It wasn't the kind you brag about. It was the kind that leaves you older. Months passed. The teacher vanished from town. Some said he moved states, others said he found work at a private tutoring center. I didn't care. My daughter started smiling again. She joined a debate club. Her new teacher told me she was one of the best speakers in class. That meant more than any court paper. But still, late at night, I'd catch myself thinking about him. The teacher, his smirk, the disbelief on his face when the verdict was read. And I'd wonder, did he ever understand why this happened? Or did he just blame me like everyone else who can't face their own cruelty? One afternoon, months later, I got a letter. No return address. Just my name in shaky handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. I never meant to hurt her. I thought being tough made them stronger. Maybe I was wrong. I lost everything because of this. But maybe I needed to. It wasn't signed. But I knew who wrote it. For a long moment I just stared at the letter. I didn't feel victory. I didn't feel pity either. Only a strange kind of peace, like the circle had finally closed. I folded it, put it in a drawer, and never mentioned it to my daughter. A few weeks later, the local paper ran a follow-up article. Parents' legal battle leads to new state guidelines for classroom conduct. It turned out the case had forced the district to rewrite its policy on teacher behavior. Every school now required sensitivity training and a clear complaint process. I read that line 3 times. That's when I finally smiled. Because now my daughter's pain had built something that would protect others. That was the real revenge. Not the money, not the punishment, but the change. Still, part of me couldn't resist one last move. I took the letter he'd sent me, the one with his apology, and mailed a copy to the district's HR office. No note, no explanation. Just the words, maybe I was wrong. Let them read it. Let it live in his file forever. And when I sealed the envelope, I realized something I hadn't before. Revenge isn't about making someone suffer. It's about making sure they remember. And trust me, he will. The months after the verdict felt like walking through water. Each step slow, but you still move forward. People stopped asking me about the case at the grocery store. They either thought it was settled or they were tired of the conversation. The news cycle moved on. The teacher's name faded from headlines, but the policy memos and training schedules did not. That quiet persistence was more important to me than any headline. My daughter changed in the small, steady ways that mattered. She slept through the night again. She raised her hand in class. She laughed at dinner without forcing it. Once, she came home with a certificate for a speech she'd given. She placed it on the mantel like a trophy and beamed. Those days were the reason I'd kept going when it felt easier to fold. There were practical things too. The settlement money, the $20,000, we used it for therapy and to cover sessions for her teacher transition. We put a chunk into a savings account for emergencies, and another small part for the debate club fees. It wasn't triumphal in any cinematic way, it was ordinary, responsible. It felt right. People told me I had won. They meant the legal outcome, the policy changes, the teacher's professional ruin. But winning, I learned, is not always a clean thing. The cost was real. I'd lost neighbors who'd called me trouble or too harsh. I'd had friends stop inviting us to barbecues. I had to explain over and over to relatives why I didn't back down. The emotional labor kept piling up even after the legal labor subsided. Every so often I'd see Mr. H in someone else's face, a gruff tone at a PTA meeting, a trimmed mustache at the hardware store, a sharp word dropped at a holiday. The image of him was never simple, sometimes cruel, sometimes confused, sometimes genuinely hurt. People are complicated, and courtroom verdicts don't suddenly make them saints or monsters. But the consequences had stuck, that was clear. A year and a half later I got a call from Patel. He'd found something he thought I should see. There's a local foundation looking to sponsor a school program on teacher training, he said. They heard about the case and want to fund a pilot in our district. They asked if you'd participate in a panel. I hesitated. Public speaking felt foreign after the months of legal paperwork and interviews. But when he said the program would reach dozens of schools and tens of teachers, I agreed. The panel was small, held in a fluorescent-lit conference room at the education center. There were counselors, district officials, 2 teachers who had changed schools, and me, still awkward at a podium. We talked about accountability, about how adults respond when kids are harmed, about systems that let behavior fester. I spoke about evidence, voicemails, medical notes, witnesses. I spoke about persistence. I hoped my words would encourage someone else to document, to stand, to file a complaint when they saw cruelty. After the panel, a woman approached me. She was quieter than most of the room, with hair pulled back and eyes that had seen too much. "My son was in your daughter's class," she said. "I want to thank you." He told me he felt he could finally talk about what happened to him. She hugged me for a moment and then left. That small thank you settled inside me like a coin. Not everyone praised what I'd done. The teacher's attorney still sent bills and occasional legal notices, small attempts to reopen past grievances. Social media dredged up old comments from strangers who wondered if I'd gone too far. But the town was different. Parents were more likely to come to meetings. Principals called for trainings. Children who wouldn't have spoken up before suddenly had a clearer pathway. Sometimes I thought about revenge in a different way. The settlement and the suspension were immediate consequences, but the lasting change, the trainings, the complaint procedures, the culture shift, felt like something that would outlive both me and the teacher. That was the kind of outcome I wanted when I began this. I wanted a future where a child's tears could not be dismissed as a teacher's tough love. Months later, I ran into Mr. H at the county courthouse. He was there for some licensing paperwork. His hair was thinner, his stoop deeper. For a moment neither of us moved. He looked at me directly, and for the first time since the complaint, his face registered something like remorse. He didn't speak. I didn't either. There was nothing to say that a courtroom record hadn't already said. Still, the sight of him walking away stayed with me. I thought about the letter he'd sent me, the unsigned apology that slid under my door. I thought about how people can be hardened into habits, how a man's identity as tough can become a prison. My revenge had not been cathartic spectacle. It had been a lever pulled, gears turned, systems nudged. In the quiet that followed, I sometimes wondered whether there was room for forgiveness in a life that had been altered. Forgiveness didn't come like a flood. It came in small increments. A supportive teacher offering extra help, a neighbor who waved in the street, my daughter's laughter unforced. Justice had been served in the institutional sense, but the human sense, the softer patching of things, took time. One afternoon, a year after the final hearing, my daughter and I walked past the school. The playground had new signs about respect and anti-bullying. A poster in the window announced a community workshop. She pointed at the poster and said, "Daddy, can I help teach that one day?" My chest tightened. "Yes," I said. "Yes, you can." On the drive home, I thought about stories and how they end. Some people like a tidy closure, some prefer chaos. My story had a legal ending, a social ending, and a personal ending that would evolve. For me, the real ending wasn't the money or the suspension. It was the moment my daughter dared to read aloud in class again. That was the undoing of the harm. There was one more practical thing I did before putting the folder of evidence into a drawer. I photocopied the unsigned letter Mr. H had sent me, the one with the shaky handwriting and the single sentence, "Maybe I was wrong." I mailed a copy to the district human resources office with no note. I wanted his regret, or whatever it was, to be recorded in the file that would follow him if he ever sought work in education again. When the envelope was stamped and dropped at the post, I felt a small, private satisfaction. It wasn't cruelty. It was accountability. A reminder, actions have consequences and consequences should be visible. Years later, when the story occasionally resurfaced in some true crime podcast or a parenting blog, people asked if I'd lost my soul pursuing the case. I'd tell them the same thing. I didn't pursue to destroy. I pursued to protect. I didn't want vengeance. I wanted a safer classroom. If that made me hard in other people's eyes, I accepted that trade. In the quiet nights when my daughter slept, I'd sometimes think of Mr. H and wonder if the man I fought had any other parts left, father, brother, friend, or if he'd been reduced to a cautionary tale. I hoped he'd learned something. I hoped the loss had turned into reflection. But hope is not the same as forgiveness. When my daughter was older, she asked me once, "Did you ever hate him?" The question surprised me with its bluntness. I thought about the long process, the hearings, the rumors, the nights I replayed her cries in my head. "I was angry," I said, "for a long time. But I used that anger to change things." She nodded, like she understood more than I'd given her credit for. The town moved on. People made new mistakes and sometimes new amends. Policies adjusted. Teachers were retrained. Children grew up. The folder in my drawer gathered dust. Once in a while, I'd open it and run my finger along the corner of the doctor's note, the voicemail printout, the copy of the final order. I kept it not as a trophy but as a reminder. The small acts you do to protect someone are worth the trouble. Revenge had been the instrument I chose. It worked in the narrow, practical way I had intended. But the real measure of that choice was how the world changed afterward. The programs, the policies, the children who felt safer. That was the cost I'd paid and the return I'd wanted. And sometimes, late at night, when the house is still and the debate club papers are stacked on the table, I let myself imagine the teacher in a different life. Older, quieter, maybe teaching in a community college where fewer children depended on him. Maybe, in some way, paying the price had made him less dangerous. Maybe that was enough.